I think the word anxiety can be one of the most daunting phrases a parent could ever engage, especially with their teenagers. And that daunting phrase can lead many parents into dark places to wonder what they did or what kind of cultural forces are challenging their kids. And it can make us do sometimes irrational things to keep our kids from having anxiety. Well, today in the Celebrate Kids podcast, in this daily segment, Facing the Dark, we're going to look at this issue head on and look at some different trends that are happening inside of culture. And Dr. Kathy's going to give us some good insight on how we can step forward with confidence to make sure that we address them.
Don't be afraid of the dark. Be careful with stars. Not every light is going to guide you, baby. Not every light is going to guide you.
So, Dr. Kathy, the New York Times took to print about the current state of young people and their anxiety about the future and politics. They report that just 1/3 of respondents ages 12 to 17 said things were going well for kids and teenagers today. Less than half said that they thought they would be better off than their parents when they grow up. That's a downbeat view shared among many teenagers in many rich countries. That's what other data is showing, as the New York Times reports. So, Dr. Kathy, recently you're on Janet Parshall's show on the Moody Radio Network, and you talked briefly about being anxious and having anxiety. Can you help me understand what the difference is between being anxious and having anxiety, and what ends up driving an unhealthy view of the future that ends up pushing teens towards anxiety?
Yeah, I'd love to. This is such an important topic. You know, it's possible for adults and children to have, to be anxious about a spelling test or anxious about a promotion at work or anxious about whether or not their team will make it into the Super Bowl. That is not the same thing as having a generalized state of anxiety, where it would be a 24/7, 365, not necessarily triggered by any one thing. It is a part of who they are, just like being tall is a part of who I am. And it does tend to have a relationship with your thoughts about the future. That's how it's different from fear. Fear is usually assigned to something that's very real in the present, like a spelling test or a Super Bowl game. And where anxiety, in a general sense, is more about, can I control the future? Will the future be bright? And, today with so much negative news and so many naysayers in our culture, even about, your gender will never, or your generation will never amount to anything. And, you're born in the wrong gender. There's just so much confusion for our kids that I think because their present is confusing, their future is unknown. And that would increase their anxiety.
Why is it important for parents to have that differentiation between being anxious and having anxiety? Why should we, maybe I would say, kind of have an understanding of, I don't know, I don't want to play the vernacular game, right? Does it end up just being semantics at the end of the day? Or is it really helpful for us to know the difference because it helps us as parents engage it differently? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, no, I think it's actually very important. So I'm glad you asked, because if I know of a child who has anxiety, who is a 24/7, 365 anxious, they need help. Those kids do not want to live in their skin. They don't want to be, continually worried about their tomorrows and wondering about what's going to happen today. So absolutely pay attention to that. And possibly they need counseling and therapy. Possibly they need to meet with a pediatrician. There is medication that helps. No shame, no blame, because things are really confusing. Or better yet, a change of circumstances, if at all possible. Versus a child who is anxious, they need strategies. Now, all kids can benefit from strategies. Here are healthier thoughts. Here are healthier ways to use your spare time that will build you up and not tear you down. But I think that would be the major difference. Do they get help, or do we feel like we can help on their own?
Yeah, Dr. Kathy, I think that's helpful to think through that, process it, and also to come to the reality that, sometimes we kind of all go through anxious thoughts. But I don't think everyone necessarily has that, right? Not every adult kind of walks through this place of where they would say, I'm anxious. Or maybe even we look at our kids and say, my kid's not necessarily anxious. But I do think that all of us really need or have this proclivity, right? This leaning in towards having hope. That's something that the Apostle Paul talks about in the New Testament. And I think it's interesting because he really kind of outlines it through many of the New Testament epistles, that hope is something that you should strive for, that you should have. And really, he kind of uses this phrase. I love it. He kind of says, hope does not disappoint. That's something that he writes. Why is it dangerous for teens to feel hopeless? Anxiety or anxious thoughts can often drive us towards hopelessness. Why should we have or build into our kids this idea of hope? And how can we help them develop a sense of having hopefulness?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Being hopeful is one of the top character qualities in the book that I've written, one of the top 48. It is essential. Wayne, without hope, I might as well die. Without hope, I don't have purpose. I don't believe that I can be an effective mate. I don't believe that I can change the future. I don't believe I can lead. I don't believe I follow well. I don't believe grades matter. I don't believe I'll make it into college. I mean, there's just so much negativity that comes with this reality that I don't have any hope. So parents have to pay attention, and children have to know who they are, because it's in our identity that we will so often see our purpose and our belonging and so much more of our life. And I appreciate you bringing up Paul. You know, biblical hope does not disappoint. Hope that is rooted in God, the God of the Bible, who is sovereign. He does understand. He does know. He's never surprised. And we can argue with God. You know, Job did. You know, we can say, really, God, do you think that was a good idea? But ultimately, those of us who follow Christ and read the Bible faithfully to learn from it recognize that God is big enough to handle all of the mess that we create, and it will ultimately be okay. Let's remind children, when they hope in God, they mount up on wings like eagles, and they can fly, and they can run, and they can walk and not be weary. And are we modeling that before them?
Yeah, I want to do that. I want to do that for my kids. I want to, not that I want them to, go and jump on anything that's going to fly and jump on the wings, right? But there is a reality that I want them to have that sense of they can kind of soar above whatever challenges they face. But the reality for most of us is that we feel oftentimes almost like part of the machine of society, right? Like politics are happening, YouTube is happening, culture is happening, all these things are happening, and we kind of end up receiving it, which can sometimes kind of make us feel like we're in a hopeless time. But I want to have you kind of give a perspective here for some family members or some different parents or people that are working with kids that might feel like that, or work with their kids that feel like that. What do you do when you really feel like you are in a hopeless time? And how can we give this sense of developing and guiding kids to having hope?
Well, I think it's important that we admit it, and that's important that we are present to our children and young adults so that they can feel good about coming to us and say, Dad, the hopelessness continues and I'm not sure how to get out of the hole. So let's be available and let's not panic when they're brave enough to share their reality with us. I think that's huge. I think we need to point out how good it is. I have a very good friend who's a pastor who says to his flock every Sunday, that this is a great time to be a Christian. And I love that perspective. Like, there are people who are so upset and so angry and so concerned, and there are many things to be concerned about. That's not what he's saying. But he's saying that God would choose us to live in a time when there are practical things we can do that make a difference. What a glorious time to be alive. And so let's share that with our kids, that this is a time for us to live like Esther lived. And she saved an entire people group because of her obedience. And the other thing that has been really effective for me is to share stories of children who are changing culture, children who are making a difference. Do you know, Wayne, that a child in, I believe it was Detroit, well, two really quick stories. One was a child who invented a coat that becomes a sleeping bag. I think it was Detroit. She was concerned about the homeless population in the winter, and she invented a coat a person can wear, and then you zip it differently and it becomes a sleeping bag. That's brilliant. There was a child, I think in San Francisco, but don't quote me, who was upset about the homeless population, and she knew that if they got a shower, they would feel better. And if they got a shower, they might be able to go interview for a job. And she convinced the city to turn buses into mobile shower units. That's brilliant. Those are children who are open to what could I do today. Let's give testimony to that and tell other kids about who they are so they believe they can do something powerful.
I'm going to be honest, the things that Dr. Kathy talked about today, they're really big in my heart. I get nervous for my kids to have anxiety or to feel bad. It reminds me a little bit of the story of Esther. That's something that Dr. Kathy referenced today. And I'm going to read for us a little passage that comes out of Esther chapter 4. Leading up to this, Esther's really wrestling with what's about to happen to the Jews. And she has a unique place in this time and place. And she writes to Mordecai to kind of say that people are going to be put to death if they don't get invited to the king's chamber. And it's been 30 days since she was called to go to the king. And to go and stand before the king wasn't something that she thought that she would be able to live through. Mordecai gives this response out of Esther chapter 4, and I'm going to begin reading at verse 13. He sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" There's stories in my life where I acted in ways that really were brave in some cases, or outside of myself, because I was fearful for this thing that Mordecai writes to Esther, that God is going to arise someone else to take the place that God has called me to if I don't step into the gap. Now, I don't think that that's necessarily true all the time, but I do think that that spirit can be there. And I also think that God has called us as parents into this time and place with the kids we have, with the cultural milieu of anxiety that's so prevalent for such a time as this. And so I hope that you've been encouraged today from what Dr. Kathy said, to go and face dark times, to have hard conversations, to take your kid out of school and go do something with them, to break this cultural rhythm that calls to them to be anxious. I think stepping in the gap and doing something that's extraordinary, something like what Esther did, those are the things that are going to shine brightly in dark times. And I think that's what our kids need, especially as they're battling with the darkness of anxiety. I want to thank you for listening to the Celebrate Kids podcast in this, our daily segment, Facing the Dark. On behalf of Dr. Kathy Cook, my name is Wayne Stender, and I want to say thanks for listening, and I'm looking forward to seeing you here again tomorrow.